Decades later, and with a very fine collection of maps that track the exploration and settlement of Colorado and Western North America from the 16th century through to the 20th, Wes is well placed to introduce us to the mapping of New Spain. We'll be taking questions after his presentation, so could I ask you please to write your questions into the chat box where Katie will pass them on to Wes. Wes, would you like to share your screen and enlighten us on Alzate y Ramirez and the mapping of New Spain? Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
I can.
And do you see this little red dot floating about?
I do. It's circling Wes Brown.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm so honored to be your speaker today and thrilled to be with you. And I see so many friends on the screen and people I wish I could get to know. In 2000, so now I have a free, there we go. In 2007, attending the Festival of Maps in Chicago, I walked into an exhibit at the Newberry Library of Western Maps. And as I walked around one of the corners in the exhibit, I found this extraordinary map. It's a map of New Spain, and it's all of New Spain. This is the area of Mexico and the Western United States that was then controlled by Spain, essentially everything west of the Mississippi River. And it's based upon Spanish information. And for me, it showed new information north of Taos, which is in New Mexico, south of Colorado, and there's never any information up there. So I was really excited. But this map shouldn't be. The Spanish never allowed cartographic info to be printed. This rigid tradition began way back in the 15th century, with geographic information treated as secret by the Spanish authorities for fear of its release to assist foreign competition. So now, as I begin the story, I'm going to let you gaze at this map, and you can familiarize yourself with several rivers. I want you to pay particular attention to the Rio Grande here. This would be Santa Fe right about there. And the Colorado River of the West, as it joins with the Gila. We're going to be talking about this area a lot. You'll notice there's another Colorado River in Texas, and that will not enter our discussion. So if I mention the Colorado River, I'm always talking about the western one. Now, let me provide some cartographic background before we jump into the map. Prior to Coronado's expedition, essentially nothing was known of the interior of the West north of Old Mexico. Coronado's exhausting trek for gold returned in 1542 with nothing. They went up about like where the red dot is going into New Mexico and Arizona, then New Mexico, and up to about this point in southern Kansas, and then came back. So this halts exploration in the north. There was plenty of rich silver mines in Mexico, and the poor native villages of the northern prairies, mountains, and deserts had little to offer. So now we'll go on to 4 key maps, which will tell the story in summary of the next 2 centuries. Ramusio's map was the first printed map to show Coronado's results, and we see in the west the 7 cities of Cibola. Now, the interior is full of mythical information. It's really speculation based upon rumors from people that they met on their journey. And the next 100 years, although many maps would be produced, would show little improvement. But that would change with this map by the great French map maker Nicolas Sanson that helped push France into the vanguard of map making at that time. And what we see if we look at a close-up of the West is actual information along the Rio Grande River. And it comes from the journals of Friar Benavides, who was in this area seeking to convert the natives. He wrote a journal which got in the hands of Sanson, and we see that information. So now what we have are actual Spanish settlements like Santa Fe and Taos. We have Indian pueblos that are throughout there that are real places, and we have Indian names, tribal names like Apache and Navajo for essentially the first time on a printed map. Now you'll notice the Rio Grande, which is shown here as the Rio del Norte, is a little confused because it should be dropping into the Gulf of Mexico. It's dropping into what would become the Gulf of California. We move 30 years further, and we come to this wonderful map by the Italian Vincenzo Maria Cornelli, who was in his in Venice, produced a wonderful atlas which contained this map. And if we look at a close-up of it, we see even more information about the Rio Grande Valley. And this would come from the governor of New Mexico, Don Diego de Peñalosa, who ruled the northernmost Spanish territory from Santa Fe from 1661 to 1664, was a really bad guy. He was a rough person. In fact, his conduct was so inappropriate that he was banned from New Spain for outrageous conduct. Peñalosa went to Europe to stir up trouble and to peddle his information first to the English and then successfully to the French. But this allowed Cornelli to obtain his greater refined information that we see in this upper Rio Grande area. And it would stay that way for almost 100 years and hardly be improved. The final map in our tour is this brilliant work by Guillaume de Lille, produced in 1718. And you see the great understanding for the first time. In fact, let me go back. Notice that on Cornelli's map, the Mississippi River is highly confused because it's 500 miles too far to the west. We don't have time to go into that tale right now, but there is something in the recent IMCoS journal that will tell about that story. But going back to this, de Lille now is going to show us this area for the first time. And so this would be the great advance, and very little advancements in the area that we're going to be talking about would occur up for the next 50 years when Alzate's map gets made. So I'm just going to give you a little review of what was shown and known. So de Lille knew and mapped this area of the Mississippi. Part of the Missouri River was understood, a little ways up the Missouri. A little bit of the Arkansas was understood. A bit of the Red was understood. The Gulf Coast of Texas had been explored, and it had also, the Frenchman Saint-Denis between 1713 and 1716 had worked his way back and forth through the rivers of Texas. But I want you to imagine yourself hundreds of miles from the coast, going through a forest or a plain or a grassland, and you come across this river. Well, you know where it is 500 miles to the north, but where would it be to the south? So the rivers of Texas are very confused. And then this Rio Grande had been known for a very long time. And as we've seen, this area right here, now go to my next slide, this area of the new state of New Mexico was pretty well known. But Taos, which was right about here, nothing north of Taos was known. So what is in Colorado and in Utah at this time of making this map was completely unknown. In fact, almost all this area around this, with the exception of this coming up the Rio Grande and along the Gila River, Now, why would that be? It seems strange that this one area would be penetrated up into the unknown continent. Well, Santa Fe was founded in 1610. Now, to put that in context in English, in American history, the first English settlement, Jamestown, was 1607, Quebec 1608. So this was very, very early. So why would it be known with the rest of this unknown? Well, the Puebloan people who lived on the Rio Grande, they were stationary. They lived in stationary habitations and they were farmers. They were an agricultural society and they were subdued and enslaved by the Spanish authorities. But all around that, and this was somewhat true of the Gila Valley as well, but all around that area, the native people were nomadic, with a few very small exceptions. And they were essentially unconquerable. In fact, they were so unconquerable, so formidable, that anytime Spanish authorities tried to put an outpost anywhere else, including up in my state, Colorado, that outpost would very quickly be annihilated, everybody killed, and they'd collapse back into this area. So with that introduction, let's now go back to the Alzate map. We're looking at the French edition printed in France, and this was in the Barry MacLean collection. It's one of only 7 known copies of the French edition. I was able to buy this wonderful copy, one of only 8 known copies of the Spanish edition in a Dorothy Sloan auction several years ago. Now, this was made by a Mexican Renaissance man, Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez, and I'll often call him Don Antonio. It contains Spanish information not previously shown on maps. It attempts to map all of New Spain. Which is very unusual because Spanish maps, which are almost all just manuscript maps, generally focused on smaller regions at that time. It looks north of Taos, which was 70 miles north of Santa Fe, with new information scattered about, which is incredibly interesting. This information up in the Western United States. It's the first printed map to name Texas as a region. The map in its 2 simplified variants is the only printed map of New Spain by a Spaniard or a Mexican that appeared during the 18th century. Now, as I began my investigation and didn't know much about the map, I kept coming into crazy questions. The printed map is attributed to Alzate, but was he really responsible for it? It wasn't clear since the printed map contains so many significant changes from the manuscript we know that he made just 1 year earlier. If it was made by Alzate, why send seemingly valuable Spanish information to the French? The map was dated 1768, but evidence suggests that it was printed much later. It was published in 2 editions, French and Spanish. Who were the publishers? Neither is stated on the map. Which came first? When were they printed? Only 15 printed copies are known to exist. Why so few? And the general custom of map makers was to copy maps of perceived authority. Why did this have such a little impact? So we're going to try to unravel these mysteries. And let me first tell you about this man. Don Antonio was born in 1737 to wealthy parents near Mexico City in the town of Ozumba, subsequently renamed Ozumba de Alzate in his honor. He received a prestigious Jesuit education and a Bachelor of Theology degree in 1756. Shortly after, he joined the priesthood and then embarked on scientific investigation into the wide range of subjects, publishing, for example, on weather observation, archaeological ruins, volcanoes, psychedelic properties of plants, astronomical observations during the transit of Venus. He launched Gazzetta de Literatura, a successful gazetteer of literature, which thrived from 1788 to 1795. Many of his scholarly papers were published by the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, perhaps then the most respected scientific body in the world. In fact, his printed map, which is the subject of our talk, was dedicated to that august body by him. Don Antonio became a leading advocate of Enlightenment principles of scientific investigation in the New World. And he was actually elected by the French Academy to the French Academy in 1771, becoming its New World correspondent, which is a tremendous honor for a colonial. So well respected was he that in 1884, when Mexicans created a scientific society, it was called the Antonio Alzate Scientific Society, which later became the Mexican National Academy of Sciences. And his name still graces the journal to this day. So he's really a wonderful man. I think of him as Mexico's Alexander von Humboldt. He's that kind of a figure. Now, I'd like to summarize for you some of Alzate's surviving maps. Don Antonio was not a trained cartographer, but he supplemented his own geographic and astronomical evaluations with study of official manuscript maps stored in Mexico City. And with no training, he resolved to produce maps of the entirety of New Spain, a vast, largely unknown area. His first surviving manuscript is a massive map of New Spain dated 1767. He saw it, you see it here, bound with vignettes of wondrous animals, birds, and native peoples. It covers a vast area of North America, north to the 44th parallel and east to Florida. A second manuscript map of New Spain that has survived was dated 1772. Now, though smaller, it covers the same area as the earlier manuscript map, but includes significant changes we're going to talk about, especially in the upper Rio Grande Valley and Texas. A third manuscript dated 1775 also exists. It's very similar to this, so I don't show it. It's held in the British Library. In addition to the printed map of 1768 that we'll talk about, Alzate produced a smaller printed map to accompany a history of New Spain by Francisco Antonio de Lorenzana, Mexico City's Archbishop, published in 1770. Now, you see this version shows virtually no place names and doesn't go very far north. So how did the printed map come about? Early in 1768, Don Antonio sent a manuscript map of New Spain to the Royal Academy of Sciences. Now, this was different than the map we looked at, that very first map, this one, which he made in 1767, the year before. Although this manuscript has been lost, a manuscript copy is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And I will refer to this map that you see as the Buache manuscript. Attached to this map is a handwritten note in French on the back that had not been noted by other scholars before. And I will give you a translation of this copy of the new written map of New Mexico, etc., dedicated to the Royal Academy of Sciences of Paris by Mr. Joseph Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez, received in June 1768 and carried out under the supervision of Mr. Buache, first geographer to the king, according to the deliberation of the Academy of September 6th of this year, to be transmitted to the Abbot Shop de Haute-Roche, who must pass constantly through this part of America, signed by the Secretary of the Academy. What a gift this was to me to find this authoritative label explaining what had happened. Now, from this note and other writings, we know that Don Antonio willingly sent his manuscript to New Spain to the French Academy, and that Philip Buache not only made this surviving copy, but he made at least one other that was transmitted to the explorer Abbot Shop, and we will discuss him later. The Buache manuscript served as the basis for both the French and the Spanish edition, which were printed and sold some years later. The geography of these, the legends, the place names are virtually identical, both the French and Spanish. All the detail is printed in Spanish on both editions. The French language is used on the French edition only for its major titles and 2 tables on the map. Now we know that in 1768, Philip Buache made the manuscript copy of Alzate's map. And now, after a lot of research, which is described in the article in this 2019 journal of the IMCoS journal, I will summarize without taking you through the painstaking exploration what we've learned about the printing. The French edition was the first printed in 1775 by Buache's nephew, Jean-Nicolas Buache de la Neuville. A second state was printed after 1780, sometime probably in the 1780s. Sometime after 1775, famed Spanish publisher Tomás López made his more refined copy of the map, cleaned up some Spanish misspellings, and then printed the map again in a second state we know is after 1783 and most likely 1792. Now, henceforth, these 2 editions I'm going to refer to as just the map. So let's now investigate its geography. The map is large, detailed, clearly engraved, and most of the known examples have outline hand cover. It shows all of the area that then controlled by the Spain in North America, which is divided into 6 bishoprics. Unlike Alzate's manuscript maps, the printed version has no decoration. It is surrounded by both latitudinal and longitudinal scales. The longitudinal scale uses the island of Faro, the westernmost of the Canary Islands, as the prime meridian. The map is unusual in that it covers the whole of New Spain. As I said, most of the detail of the map is concentrated on central Mexico, as you can plainly see, which was generally quite accurate. In contrast, information on the map's northern portion is sparse, and much of the information is erroneous. Of course, there was so little information known of the northern areas that even these tidbits are more than on other printed maps and are today fascinating and worthy of study. Accordingly, I will concentrate my talk on the region which is today the Western United States. And let's begin with Texas. The map shows 4 active presidios, which are garrisoned fortresses in Texas, including San Antonio de Bejar with 5 of its missions. The town of Ideas, east of the Sabine River, is shown as the regional capital. It was moved to San Antonio just a few years after this map was made. Although Guillaume de Lisle's 1718 Carte de la Louisiane is the first to mention Mission de los Tejas on a printed map, Alzate is the first to use Texas to describe the region on a printed map, which it does with the bold legend Provincia de los Texas. Prior to Alzate, the best printed image of Texas was de Lisle's from 1718. And unfortunately, even 50 years later, Don Antonio's illustration of the rivers is not much improved. The rivers of Texas are very confused, some flowing from way too far north, some as far north as today's state of Kansas, which would be way off of your map there. Now, I want to assure you, trust me, folks, no Kansan would ever allow their water to be delivered to the Texans. An overall impression of Alzate's rivers is that they flow north to south, rather than the correct southeasterly direction. So this is a puzzle. Comparing the Texas region on Alzate's first manuscript, made just 1 year before, the rivers seem more accurate on this earlier map than on the printed version, which we know came from his manuscript that he sent to Paris. So how do we explain this discrepancy? Why in Texas does Don Antonio seem to have regressed? Well, the answer may come from Alzate's use of Francisco Alvarez Barrero of the Spanish military as a key source of the 1768 map. Barrero, a military engineer, made firsthand observations of the region of Texas over 8 years on General Martin de Alarcon's explorations and later those of Brigadier Don Pedro de Rivera. In charge of cartography, Barrero produced several key manuscript maps of all the northern provinces in 1729. And Alzate used these. In fact, he credits Barrero as one of his sources. Careful examination reveals that the Texas region on the printed Alzate map is a word-for-word reproduction of Barrero's general manuscript map of the area. Barrero River flow in a north-south direction. On Dan Antonio's earlier 1767 manuscript, the rivers, as we said, flowed southeast. And other features and names generally follow the French model illustrated by Delisle in 1718. So how do we explain this? Well, I postulate that seeking to show the French Royal Society something different, Alzate did not want the Texas region to look like the familiar Texas depicted by Delisle that had become the standard on most European maps during the prior 50 years. By illustrating Texas according to Barrero, Alzate could show the members of the French Academy something wholly Spanish and previously unknown to them. Now, the mapmaker's confusions about Texas are minor compared to his depiction of the far north and west, where geographic uncertainty manifests. Alta California shows detail only along the coast, and much of that is incorrect. No California missions are present because the first would not be started until the year after this manuscript was made. The term Sierra Nevadas is applied to mountains indiscriminately placed inland. Now, I don't have time to deal with all these fascinating things except for two. We're going to start with Alzate's manuscript map of 1667 and 1772, and it depicts large inland bodies of water from the Pacific coast eastward a full 10 degrees. Now, many of you will know this as the Sea of the West. It does not appear on the 1768 printed map, as its northern boundary only extends to 42 degrees, just south of this area on Alzate's manuscript maps. Only the strait that leads to the Sea of the West is shown on the printed map as it moves northwest to the upper border. Now, Philip Buash, who oversaw the preparation of the manuscript copy from which the printed map derives, was one of the most ardent advocates of the mythical Sea of the West. With both Alzate and the French publisher believing in the myth, I was quite surprised to see that Alzate's restrained in establishing 42 degrees as the upper limit of this map, therefore not showing the Sea of the West. However, doubt about this myth was really growing, and by 1768, there was great concern. Perhaps Alzate did not want to gamble on this controversy with the map he submitted to the French Academy of Sciences. The geographical feature just below this strait is a river entering the Pacific Ocean, noted in translation, River Tizon, which it is said to have been discovered by Juan de Oñate, as well as the port of St. Paul's conversion. So at first glance, this legend makes no sense. But after study, we find the placement of this text constitutes one of the most remarkable travels of a toponym on any American map. So let's look at a little history of the river's nomenclature. In 1604, Juan de Oñate led an expedition from New Mexico to the Colorado River area, where it joins the Gila, and then south to the river's outlet into the Gulf of California, the outlet which he named Puerto de la Conversión de San Pablo. The Colorado River had been named the River Tizon 65 years earlier and had not been named Colorado River, was going by Tizon at the time that Oñate was there. When Don Antonio replaced it with its modern name, and we see River Colorado, Rio de Colorado right here, How did this ancient term get moved to the north? A crazy puzzle. Oñate believed that the River de Tizon, the Colorado River, may have been the fabled river of the West, which reportedly flowed into the Gulf of California and ultimately the Pacific Ocean. These ideas later became confused with notions that California was an island, and perhaps led to the belief that the waters of the T-zone emptied into the Pacific near the north coast of the fictitious island of California. With the mythical island's removal from maps, Alzate moved the place name in the Rio de Tizon and the legend relating to Oñate to the Pacific coast, about at the border between today's Oregon and California, where it really makes no sense. Now, this is not the end of the saga. After the acclaimed 1776 expedition of Escalante and Dominguez, Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco produced his famous manuscript map of the expedition in 1777. And he inserts in the northwest corner, next to the toponym Laguna de los Timpanogos, which was the Great Salt Lake, a large river flowing due west to the map's border. Here, Miera added the legend following Barreiro and following Alzate. The legend in translation, this has to be the Rio del Tizon, discovered long ago by Juan de Oñate. So in sum, the Oñate's discovery is celebrated on maps in what would become southern Arizona, northern California, and Utah. The area of the upper Rio Grande is significantly improved over prior maps in print. But unlike prior maps, Alzate attempts to illustrate terrain north of Taos, in which would become Colorado. And of course, that really turned me on. For example, a legend created by Alzate northeast of Taos translates as Pass of Don Fernando, by which the Comanches penetrate into New Mexico. Now, Don Fernando de Chavez was the leading settler at the Taos Pueblo. In late summer of 1760, just 8 years before the manuscript was made, an estimated 3,000 Comanches descended on the Taos Valley via this pass, intent on destroying the Pueblo Indians. They carried away 56 women and children who were never seen again. Now, many of these place names are fascinating, have crazy stories I'd love to tell you about, but we have time for just one more. The map is the first in print to illustrate Laguna de Tahuayo. Alzate derived this lake from Barreiro, but he curiously moves the lake to the area of the Great Salt Lake, perhaps based on some native rumors. The place name Tahuayo, a native word, and I'm using their pronunciation, is referring to the Indians of the Great Basin, which would become, on later maps, the large Utah Lake, which became just south of the Great Salt Lake. So he was quite insightful, or maybe by accident, when he put this lake right there. The area of the lower Colorado and Gila rivers in Arizona today are solidly mapped using the findings of Jesuit Father Eusebio Kino, who confirmed that California was not an island. Now, I've got one more puzzle I'd like to talk about, and it's quite interesting to me, these key geographical coordinates. Each printed map has a table of key coordinates not appearing on Don Antonio's manuscript that he sent to Paris. Now, it was difficult during the 18th century to ascertain the correct coordinates of longitude for locations distant from Europe. And Alzate was profoundly interested in the subject. In New Spain, 3 locations received the greatest interest from scientists: Veracruz on the east coast, Mexico City in the center, and Cabo San Lucas at the tip of Baja California. Indeed, Alzate states, and I quote, "Thus, from these 3 calculations alone, the true geographical position of New Spain can be considered certain." Precise observations of the transit of Venus across the sun allow astronomers to determine the longitude of various locations. These rare transits occurred only twice during the 18th century, in 1761 and in 1769. The abbot Jean-Baptiste Chappe de Hauteroche, a gifted French astronomer, had learned on his celebrated 1761 trip to Russia to observe the transit of Venus that the selection of a warmer and drier climate would increase the probability of its success. He had troubles with clouds. Cabo San Lucas at the southern tip of Baja California was perfectly placed in the path of the much anticipated 1769 transit and was certainly warmer and drier than Russia. After difficult negotiations, Charles III of Spain agreed to a joint French-Spanish expedition to Cabo San Lucas. How fortuitous for France. In the Royal Academy of Sciences, that a memoir on several natural phenomena, as well as a new manuscript map, should arrive in June 1768 from the aspiring Mexican scientist Don Antonio. This rare and presumed accurate geographical information about New Spain containing the map would be of great use to Chappe. And as we've learned, Philip Bouache hurriedly prepared 2 copies of the manuscript. One survives in Paris that we've seen, and the other was made for Chappe's expedition before he left Paris on September 18, 1768. Now they went to Cabo San Lucas, where they were joined by Spanish and Mexican astronomers to make vital observations of the transit of Venus. Now, although successful in their observations, the trip proved disastrous for the French and Spanish scientists. Chappe and most of his companions died of a local epidemic. This resulted in a delay in preparing the results, which were not completed until 1772 in France. And Bouache didn't get around to publishing Alzate's map until 1775. When it was finally published, both editions contained a new table presenting the new coordinates. We see the different coordinates in these 2 tables, the old mistaken coordinates and the correct coordinates. The French edition also acknowledges Abbot Chappe's expedition to the Baja to make these measurements. The Spanish edition fails to mention the Frenchman. Now, with all Alzate's efforts for accuracy in his coordinates, he fails to impress Alexander von Humboldt, writing in his geographical introduction to Humboldt's famous political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain. The great baron assessed the various calculations made by prior astronomers, and he states, quote, "This Mexican ecclesiastic, whom the Academy of Paris named one of their correspondents, displays more zeal than solidity in his researches. He embraced too many things at once." But I'm coming to Alzate's defense. Humboldt developed his calculations using far superior equipment and improved tables unavailable to Alzate, working 35 years before. So now let's tackle another puzzle, and that's the impact of this map. During the 18th century, Alzate's would be the only detailed printed Spanish map of New Spain. Upon its publication in 1775 and later, I would have expected that other map makers would follow the common custom of copying information from such a noted and local authority as Don Antonio. Yet overall, it seems to have little impact on maps published by the major European printed houses of the time. It was copied by Pierre-Marie François Depage to illustrate his book chronicling his voyages. It was also used as a base map for a series of regional maps of New Spain published by Juan Lopez in 1803. Alexander von Humboldt reported that he also utilized the 1768 printed map during his investigation in the archives of Mexico City in 1803. Now, these are the only uses of Don Antonio's map I've found, and I'm hoping that one of you listening will let me know of some other use of this map. Now, how can we explain this lack of impact? Well, I'm not certain, but I'll offer some theories. First, the map might not have been seen. The information without approval of the Spanish authorities might have been narrowly distributed. According to Alzate, not a single example of the printed map reached Mexico until 1792, 24 years later. As discussed, very few of the maps survived, and perhaps the print runs were too small to have an impact. An additional explanation concerns the actual date the map was printed. Although it was dated 1768, the first date was not printed until 1775, and others much later, including probably into the 1790s. By the 1780s, map makers with access to Spanish manuscripts would have been far more impressed with the Rutio and Lafores maps of 1771 that reflected the great northern inspection of Marquis de Rubi, and also Miera y Pacheco's famous 1777 map of the Escalante and Dominguez expedition. Now, of course, such restricted Spanish information wasn't yet available in the European map trade, but by the 1790s, information was emerging from French and English explorers in the Northwest that was revealed in print by Aaron Arrowsmith and Victor Callot during that decade. Thus, by the time Alzate's map was finally printed, its information was no longer the best available. A question remains as to why, in view of Spain's long tradition of secrecy, did Don Antonio dare to send such confidential geographical information to the French in 1768? Eager to publish the scientific papers with the prestigious French Society, he clearly hoped to impress them by including a detailed manuscript map dedicated to them. But was this a treasonous or a reckless move? I think not. At this time, the Bourbon King Charles III also dominated the Spanish court as Carlos III, enabling greater cooperation between previously hostile neighbors. Charles III, an intellectual liberal, also expanded academic and commercial freedom in France and Spain. 5 years before Alzate sent this map, the French and Indian War was concluded with the Treaty of Paris. So the French were no longer a threat to Spain. All of the land west of the Mississippi had been ceded by France to Spain. Finally, as we've seen, the information to the north was not that accurate, reflecting Spain's own lack of knowledge before the great discoveries of the 1770s. So in conclusion, the inadequacies of Alzate's map are clear. The details of the Northwest coast are poor. The drainage of the rivers of Texas are confused. And although the valley of the Rio Grande is well mapped, the lands north of Taos are conjecture. With the benefit of today's knowledge, it's tempting to judge this map a failure. But at the time, the area was essentially unknown. Alzate, without formal training in cartography, used great ingenuity, in my opinion, to piece together scraps of information from an otherwise blank canvas. Expressing humility in his 1772 geographical memoir, when he's praising his sources, his geographical sources, he states, and I quote, "I am not so arrogant that among them I would number the general map of the kingdom which I have executed. I lack that which is most essential to give them perfection." No other Spanish map that survives before this date attempts to illustrate all of New Spain, no other printed Spanish map, and no other Mexican dared to share information that would be published in Europe. In risking the wrath of Spanish authorities, Don Antonio stated that, and I quote, moved by the good of the nation, I might try to serve it by reducing its geography to a better state. He was a scientist seeking to understand his surroundings and to bravely share this knowledge with others. So with its many faults, the map was still the best information about this vast unknown land to be printed until the last decade of the 18th century. And I consider it a landmark in the history of North American Southwestern cartography. I can't close without thanking a few people who helped me in my research. I especially want to thank Martine Chanel Aran, Angel Abud Madrid, Augustin Hernando Rico, Dr. Donald McGurk, and Liliana Ortoya Baird. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wes. That's fantastic. I mean, that really was a panoramic view of Ramirez's work. And yes, it does leave a lot of questions, but it does sort of put forward a human being, a scientist who was driven to expose what he knew and to make it sort of available. Can we sort of have some questions? Do we have any questions, Katie?
Yeah, I'm fielding a few questions. Thanks so much for that, Wes. It was a really good illustration of how Mexico is simultaneously very connected to Europe and France and Spain in this period, but at the same time experiencing some of the difficulties of being geographically distant and not having access to the same amount of printed press centrality and things like that. So it's kind of a simultaneously periphery center issue going on. That was a really interesting illustration of that. So we do have a question coming through from Catherine Lavender, or a comment maybe. It is wonderful to see and read this wonderful map. I noticed that the legend on his portrait identified him as the Pliny of Mexico. Does that identification shed some light on his legacy? I do see him also as a von Humboldtian figure.
He's definitely a von Humboldtian figure. What was the word that you said that you saw in there?
She says that she sees on the portrait that it identified him as the Pliny of
Pliny.
Mexico. Yeah, Pliny.
Well, he was a revered figure, as I said. Could you imagine that about 70 years after his death, they would name the Mexican Scientific Society after him as his society, and only then change his name later to the Mexican Academy of Sciences. He was a remarkable figure, and he was a great illustration of the Enlightenment in the late 1700s that we read about so much in the New World with Thomas Jefferson and Humboldt and throughout Europe. He was trying to embody that whole spirit in Mexico as well.
Definitely, and then would be definitely connecting back to the Roman natural historian, as Catherine points out. Tom Paper says, thank you for your great presentation, as we all do, and then asks, why was the settlement in Santa Fe able to remain where it was while others around it were decimated?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, it wasn't. So in 1680, there was a Pueblo revolt that killed thousands of Spaniards who were there, and they drove them to the south. But by the mid 1690s, those darn Spanish, with their superior weaponry, had reclaimed the north. When you read about the history of New Mexico and these Pueblo Indians, they really were savagely subjected to the Mexican authorities. Unfortunately, these were very poor areas. And so the Spanish authorities down in Old Mexico kept hoping that someday there'd be some prosperity that would come from this outpost to the north. But it never really delivered. And when you read about these, as a matter of fact, the Utah Indians joked that the Utes, which would be a little bit north and west, joked that the little settlements placed north of Taos in the border of New Mexico and what would become Colorado were simply growing food for them, so that whenever they had a weakness of their a failure or famine, they would simply go there and decimate all the Indians, kill them all, and take their sheep or cattle, or whatever they had, back up into their areas. So I'm not sure if I'm just commenting on this area, but I believe that the sedentary nature, the agricultural nature of these Indians living in these pueblos caused them to be subjected, where the others were definitely not.
Thank you for that. Did you have any indications of indigenous informants for any parts of these maps or of any maps of this area that you've come across?
Well, that is a great question. There's no doubt that much of the little places to the north and around the Southwest is knowledge from indigenous sources for sure. So the Mexican authorities during this period would venture out from the Rio Grande Valley with some poor missionary who'd have to go to some village and try to convert them. Often these missionaries were slain, but they would bring back Indian knowledge, which is what's embodied on this map. So my guess is that almost all of the rumors and little place names and things, for example, what I showed you, the lake of the Lagoon de Tehuayo, that was a place name from the native people referring, this was a name created around the Santa Fe area, a name there used to describe the people up in the Great Basin, so up in the Northwest in Utah. So yes, I think a lot of this information is what's ended up on the map.
Very interesting. And then Yangling Zhang says, thank you. And then were some of the maps used for military actions in certain ways?
You bet. The Spanish definitely viewed the manuscript maps for their military actions, for sure. Just after this map is made, one of the maps that I really love is the one of Mira y Pacheco, in which you've heard of the Dominguez and Escalante expedition. This was an extraordinary expedition where two friars and a military astronomer and other assistants wandered up into Colorado, all the way into Utah, all the way down into Arizona and back, and made it back alive to Santa Fe without anyone losing their life. All of this was unknown territory. All that information was brought back and then taken immediately in 1777 down to Mexico City, where it was used by authorities. Copies were sent back to Spain. So yes, these maps were definitely used by military authorities. And it's remarkable that Alzate chose as a civilian to take this information, these military secrets, and publish them. That's why when I first saw the map on the wall in Chicago, I was just blown away by all that information that shouldn't be there. I didn't know about the map. It's a very, very rare map. And so that's what got me started with this investigation. So maybe in view of the time, is anything else, or should we end it there, Katie, or what's the plan, Liliana?
You've answered all the questions we've had. Thanks.
That was the last question. So yes, so we're wrapping it up perfectly at 8 p.m. Well done, Wes. That was a wonderful way to end our summer program of lectures, and hopefully we'll be able to return in the winter with another set. So thank you everybody who has attended 1, 2, 3, and 4. Look forward to seeing you all again in the winter. Okay, goodbye and good night from us. Wes, thank you, it was great.
Thank you.
Thanks. You, any of you who wish to linger for just a minute, you can show us your video and turn on your mic. I'll get rid of this screen if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Stop sharing. There we are. It's fun to visit with friends from around the world. I see Augustin Hernando waving at us right now. You are a tremendous help to me. I hardly know any Spanish, and so I was picking the brains of all these authorities around the world to help me as I investigated this map. Thanks so much for your help. I was hoping that Martine would be on the phone. On the line. She has been a frequent member of IMCoS meetings and a longtime member, and she helped me discover the text, which well, she discovered for me the text which gave us the printing date of 1775 for the first edition, and nailed that one for me. Okay, enough on the map. I'll stop talking. Thank you all.
Philip, Philip Burden has just entered just as we're all leaving, Philip. Sorry for that. Perhaps we've just, you misread the times. Okay, everybody, once again, thank you, and have a wonderful summer. And those in the Southern Hemisphere, a winter, and see you hopefully in the winter. Okay, bye now.